And then I'll answer. Somebody just unmuted themselves, and then I will answer questions at the end. And as we go through, you're free to write down anything that you want to, or not write down anything that you want to. Just remember that this is being recorded, so you can watch this video later on if you missed anything. If you want to hear anything again, the video for this will be posted, so you will be able to see it. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody so that we can get started.
Yes, sir. China, you should not be traveling.
Yeah.
Well, it's getting very, very loud.
No swearing.
Everybody. All right, so first thing I want to ask everybody, first of all, how is everybody doing? Are we all surviving?
I want to take a nap. China right now.
Why are you in China?
Go back to sleep.
You should not be in China.
Go back to sleep.
China, they better stay there.
All right, so
Not be in China right now, Mr. Avery.
we are going to China.
No, we can't go to China. We can't travel.
Hey.
We're going to get the
How can we
corona.
going to China, Mr. Ehlers?
I'm already there. See?
China?
It looks like it was made in 2004.
Oh my
All
god.
right.
I think your days are numbered now.
Made in 2004.
What?
Yeah.
I think your days are numbered now. You're in China.
They might. They
Alright.
might
Let me see.
be.
We were for like a whole day.
So, my next question. I'm going to mute everybody now.
Aww.
Y'all, why y'all so loud for?
Okay, there we go. So my next question to everybody is this, before I unmute you, did everybody see the changes to the exam that are happening? Did everybody see the message I posted? Everybody saw what is happening with the test, right? Yes?
Yeah.
I'm mad about it.
No.
You're mad about it? Why? It's easier now.
Hey, so when is it's 45 minutes of FRQ, sir, and that's it. There's no multiple choice. What the hell am I supposed to do?
Supposed to
I'm
write.
sorry for yelling.
Language there, language.
For yelling, guys. I'm sorry for yelling.
My question is, if we weren't going to take this exam, wouldn't we all pass automatically?
No.
That'd be great.
Shut up.
Probably not.
Shut up, Matthew.
You
I
wouldn't
wish.
automatically, not at all. No. The College Board was not just going to let you pass. Okay, so I already see a question that Dejanay asked, which is, when is the test? So we will have an exact date for you on Friday. April 3rd is when College Board is going to be announcing exactly what kind of question it's going to be and when that test is going to be. So I will be able to tell you that Friday. Okay, I don't know what time Friday, but as soon as Friday, I will be able to share that with you. The other question that I've already seen posted is, will it be at school? If we are back in school by May, the test will be taken at school, but it'll still be 45 minutes long and it'll still be online. If we're not back in school by then, you will take it at home. So it really just kind of depends on where we're at that point in time, okay? So that's the deal with that. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to get started. Now, since our exam only covers units 1 through 6, it didn't seem to me to continue with units 7, 8, and 9 when that's not going to be on the test. So what I had planned to do is we're going to start going back, and we're going to start reviewing units 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So this week, we will be covering unit 1, and then we'll just kind of go from there, which means today's topic is all about China, okay? Kind of interesting, given what is happening right now. So we're going to be talking about China.
Corona.
So,
Yo, who said that?
I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen so that we can get started here.
Oh my god, Alejandro's here.
Alejandro's here?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Alejandro! Yeah!
Start with this lesson, please.
I just
All right.
looked 2 minutes ago.
So it's been a long time, I know. So we're gonna go all the way back to Unit 1 for a little while, okay? And like I said, this is all about China today. Now, what I have up here on the screen right now, these are the things that you should be able to do or should.
Chestnut! I'm sorry.
What?
Chestnut is here. Emily Chestnut.
Hello, Emily Chestnut.
Hey, Emily.
That's my dog.
So
What up, Chestnut?
these are the things that you should have been able to do by the end of this first unit. Explaining the systems of government employed by the dynasties and how they developed over time. Explain the effects of Chinese cultural traditions. Explain
Remy just popping up on my screen.
on the Chinese economy over time.
Hi.
Hello.
Pay attention to the class.
So
I don't like showing my face. Sorry. You get Remy.
you can turn the thing off. All right.
You get Remy. I'm sorry.
Oh, Confucius.
Yeah, so here's where we kind of
Confucius used to
start,
babysit
and that
Jen.
is with the Song Dynasty. Now, one of the things that you need to remember about this is that prior to the Song Dynasty, okay, prior to that Song Dynasty, China was very much divided. Okay, remember China was a whole bunch of these different independent okay? And it was all because of Zhou Kuan-yin, who you see on the right there. He is the guy who really united China under the Song Dynasty. Okay, so he's kind of a name that you'll want to remember. And he makes China into, at the time, this great world power. Now, one of the things you have to realize about this is that this is the century, okay? This is the century that China really develops into a major world power. One of the last things that we talked about before we left school was China's century of humiliation, okay? And, okay, we're gonna mute everyone.
Thank you.
It's gonna last an hour for real.
All right, so hold on, we're gonna mute.
Whoa.
All right, I'm gonna mute everybody so that we can hear better.
Don't mute me.
There we go. All right, so what I was saying is this. During this century, China is really responsible for a number of major developments, okay, including obviously filial piety, which we've talked about before, Neo-Confucianism, Buddhism, of course, okay, all of these things come out of China and are new developments that take place during this particular period. Now, China also, okay, remember this is when we talk about champa rice, okay, this is when we talk about all of those other technical innovations, and then this is all about trade, okay, using labor, using artisans, merchants, etc., that make China very, very rich and very, very powerful during this time period. And so if we're thinking about the Chinese dynasties, okay, we know that our first one, of course, is going to be the Han, and they rule until about 220 during the Common Era. The Han, of course, that's when the legend of Mulan comes out. Okay, we have the Sui dynasty, who all unite China. We have the Tang dynasty, which is often referred to as the Chinese Golden Age. This is our Song dynasty, which is where we're going to focus much of our time today. Hey, we have the Yan dynasty. Eventually, we get to the Ming, and then, of course, the last one would be up until that Chinese Communist Revolution. Now, this is what I was talking about before, about how before the Song dynasty, China was very much split apart into this whole series of these independent states. Okay, and So what you see here, if you look in the light green area up on the screen there, that is the Song dynasty within China. Okay, prior to them taking over, that whole area in that light green was very much split up into a whole bunch of different, very much independent states. The Song dynasty is what unites them. Okay. And then we'll talk a little bit later today about China's influence on all those other places. Okay, the other big change that comes during this period is the spread of Buddhism. Okay, now we know Buddhism comes from India, okay, but it comes to China by way of India, and then China kind of modifies Buddhism to make it sort of suit their own purposes, and it ultimately spreads through China. So that's what this second map here that you're looking at now shows, okay? So, and then this third map that I wanted to very briefly show you talks about the trade routes within China. Remember, China becomes very, very wealthy because of this trade, okay? And so let's talk about some of those civilizations, okay? During this period, China becomes very, very large, very, very powerful, and the countries and the cultures nearby them, like the Japanese, like the Koreans, like the Vietnams, okay, they all imitate Chinese culture because it was so strong and so powerful during this time period. China is expanding its borders well into Asia, mostly because of the fact that they have such a strong state structure happening here. Okay, visitors are coming from all over the place. Okay, and then that threat is posed by those people up north, the barbarians. Now, eventually, the barbarians are going to come in, they're going to launch that particular invasion, and they eventually take over China, and we then come to know them, of course, as the Mongols. Okay. And then we said also this is that time that Buddhism takes hold. Okay. So let's continue on. Okay. We know then that, and I've already mentioned this, okay, that China becomes very disunified for a long period of time. Everything gets split up after the Han Dynasty collapses, okay, and people begin to move. They begin to migrate, okay, generally moving in a southward manner towards the Yangtze River Valley. Eventually, 60% of the population heads in that particular direction, okay, and agriculture is going to greatly increase, and it's going to have a rather profound effect on the environment at that time, okay? And so typically what happens with these Chinese dynasties is they go through a bit of a cycle, okay? You have a new dynasty. That new dynasty gets power. They claim to maintain order. And then they set up this period of time where everything is very peaceful, everything is prosperous, everybody's happy. Okay, eventually that dynasty becomes corrupt, taxes go up, and their power gets weaker. Their power is then further weakened by flood, famine, a peasant revolt perhaps, okay, just a disaster that sort of weakens the dynasty's power. And so eventually that dynasty then is seen as having lost their mandate, they get overthrown, and then a new dynasty takes over. This is the typical cycle that we see throughout a lot of Chinese history, okay? But we also see this sort of golden age when it comes to China because of the fact that they become very much unified, okay? And this tends to happen first during the Sui dynasty because they built something called the Grand Canal. Now, the Grand Canal is just what it sounds like. It's a very, very long, very lengthy canal, over 1,200 miles, as a matter of fact, that sort of links northern and southern China. That's going to serve to greatly unify China as a nation and as an empire, okay? We cannot underestimate the importance of the way that they were linked like that, okay? But it does, of course, eventually lead to the overthrow, of the Sui dynasty, okay? And so if you look at the map right here on this screen right now, you can kind of see the red line on the map. That's going to represent where the Great Wall was. But if you look, there's a much smaller sort of dashed line further down. That is going to be what the Great Canal was, okay? And so compared to the Great Wall, okay, that first canal that you see down near the bottom doesn't look that long. But if you look to the east a little bit, the second canal, or what they finally call the modern Grand Canal, that is, as you can see, quite lengthy. It goes all the way from Beijing all the way down to the city of Guangzhou, okay? Well over 1,200 miles, okay? And it absolutely links the northern part of China to the southern part of China, particularly for things like trade. Now, when we get to the Tang Dynasty, this is where we eventually see Neo-Confucianism taking hold for the first time. And of course, Neo-Confucianism takes the ideas of Confucius and kind of incorporates them with aspects, especially of Buddhism, but then a little bit of Taoism as well. But it's really mostly Buddhism mixing with Confucianism. Okay, this is also when you see a lot of Chinese art, science, and literature really beginning to take hold. But what's important here in terms of a change, so if you're talking about continuities and change over time, the big change over time that you want to focus on here is going to be that Buddhism is spreading and is becoming very influential and extremely important in China. Okay, so you really want to focus on that expansion of Buddhism. All right, and so what I want to think about right now, and it's going to be your turn to talk in a minute, okay, is Neo-Confucianism, as I just mentioned, represents a big change for this time period. And so if you were to talk about Neo-Confucianism in a continuity or change over time essay, you would need to think about and you need to analyze how it developed. And so the first question that I want to ask is, why was it developed during this time period and not earlier? And then what purpose did Neo-Confucianism serve for the people of China? And so I'm going to unmute everybody. This might be chaotic, but we'll see. Okay. And so here we go. All right. Hello again.
Wait, sir, what was the question?
I didn't remember none of that.
Wait, what was the question? What was the question?
Wait.
All right, so the question, let's try this again.
Is this recorded?
Yes.
Shut up! I want to hear Mr. Ehlers.
Okay, so the question, no, we are not doing that. The question again was, if Neo-Confucianism represents a change over time, okay, which it did, why did it not develop earlier? Why did it not happen until this?
What?
I did not know.
What was it?
What does that mean?
My dog leg kind of
The
tasty.
Song Dynasty was still like before all this.
Oh my god.
Okay, we have to figure out how to get people to take.
We can raise our hands.
There's a way to raise your hand on this.
I jungle.
Press more than press raise hand.
Wait, how do you raise your hand?
Press more and then press raise hand.
This is my class.
Why? I'm muting them.
All right, so who wants to?
Venus, we can nap.
Because I'm tired.
Can't hear anything.
I jungle.
Please stay on
I
topic.
jungle.
Please stay on topic.
Okay. This is not
You didn't mute me.
Alejandro.
What?
Alejandro.
Can we use this as family bonding time, please?
Darlene, you gotta click the
are you
unmute button.
You just talked.
Karina, your name is on your wall.
Can I sing a song? Can I sing a song?
Who's asking?
Jungle.
I don't know who's asking, but you can sing it.
Hey, renegade,
Why the heck are you guys so talkative?
I jungle.
You know how I move. You know how I.
Okay, I just muted everybody again because that was extremely chaotic. Sorry. All All right, so we're going to go back to the lesson itself. If you need to use the chat feature, you can do that because that was very, very loud. So maybe we'll use the chat feature instead of the microphone feature because that was just way too many voices all at once. So why don't we do that from now on? I'm going to keep it on mute for a little while and we'll use the chat feature. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen with you. Okay. So these were the two questions that I had asked you to consider. Okay. We talked about the spread of Buddhism and we talked about Neo-Confucianism, both being changes over time as it comes to Chinese history. And so if you were given a question or you were given some kind of an essay question asking you to analyze these changes, one of the things that you would have to do in your essay is you'd have to think about how it developed. And so you'd want to talk about why it was developed during this particular time period and not earlier. And then what was the purpose of Neo-Confucianism? Okay, what purpose did it serve for the Chinese people? Why did it happen then? Why did it not happen sooner? Why did it not happen later? What was it that was developed specifically during this time period that would allow it to spread? Those are the two things specifically that you need to think about as it relates to this, okay? And this is, again, especially true if you're going to do this as a continuity and change over time essay. All right, so if we're moving on, okay, here's the big thing about the Song dynasty. They instituted a very important structure. Okay, this is what we've talked about before when we talked about bureaucracy. Okay, under the Song dynasty, there were 6 major divisions or major branches, I guess, of the government, and you can see them up there. Okay, this is each of these departments worked under somebody that was called a censorate, who was kind of like the person that was in charge. This allowed them to split up the responsibility of the government. It was a very large bureaucracy, okay, and it allowed the government to function over such a large society, splitting it up like this. Now, this caused them to then revive something called the civil service exam, meaning if you wanted to work within the government, you had to pass this test. And by the way, this test is still used today for many branches of the government, not just in China, but in other parts of the world as well, including here, okay? And one of the big things that was covered on this exam was Confucianism. You had to know Confucianism, okay? If you were gonna work for the Chinese government, you had to be a believer in Confucianism and you had to know about it. Okay, and so the great thing about Confucianism, okay, and we'll get more into this later, is that it gave a role to everybody. Everybody had a place and everybody had a role. Obviously, schools were set up to help people prepare for this, okay, and exams came to be, Jan, stop yawning. Exams came to be a very major part of everybody's life, okay, which is still happening today. Here's the important thing, okay? This moved us away from, this civil service exam moved us away from a system that was based on who your family was. Prior to this, if you were born into a well-to-do family, you would get these jobs just because of who you were. But this exam moved us into what we call a system based on merit, which meant that if you studied, if you went to school, and you did well on this exam, you could move up in the world. And this is the first time that we see something like this happening, where people can kind of advance based on what they know, as opposed to simply who their family was, okay? And this is obviously something that a lot of aristocratic families are not gonna like that much, for the simple reason that it kind of has leveled the playing field a bit and sort of opened this up to more people. Okay, and it certainly weakens, of course, their own power. Now, if you look at this piece of artwork here, you can see this is what the civil service exam obviously would have looked like, okay? Because of this immense wealth that is coming into the Song dynasty during this time period, because of the immense wealth, okay, China really becomes a world power and really develops these, for the time, extremely modern cities. Their capital had more than 1 million people living in it, which is a very large city for that time period. Okay, you see the world's first restaurants appearing. Really, at the time, again, fancy hotels. In fact, when Marco Polo visits, okay, Marco Polo calls it, without a doubt, the finest city in the world. So this is really a very wealthy period for the Chinese, okay? They begin to get into metalworking, okay? A lot of what they call metallurgy, okay? Which they use that metal, obviously, for things like coins and tools. They use it in construction, okay? And so the iron industry especially becomes very, very important, okay? And then, of course, we have champa rice, okay? Rice is and has always been a major staple of the Chinese diet, as you probably know, okay? And so what they do, or what ends up happening with this champa rice, as you might remember, is that it's a very fast-growing rice, okay, that can, whoops, what just happened? Screen sharing has stopped as the window has closed. Sorry about that. What happens with this champa rice, let me fix that. What I was saying is that what happens with this champa rice is that it's very, very resistant to drought, okay? It can grow, there we go, okay? It can grow even in the much drier conditions down in South China and even further south over into Vietnam, okay? And so we know that champa rice can then be imported and can be sent to other parts of China and really becomes one of the first products that gets traded across and then around China. Okay, this again leads them to becoming very, very wealthy. They become the most urbanized country in the entire world at the time. They have a lot of large cities. And then they're really blessed with the fact that there are so many waterways, you know, both natural and man-made, that they could use that as a very cheap, very inexpensive way to move goods about the country, okay? So do not underestimate the importance of those waterways in terms of trade. Okay, so it's during this time period that we see a lot of these important inventions, all of which we've talked about before, right? Movable type, which is the precursor to the printing press. Gunpowder, which is discovered by accident. Obviously, paper, the compass. All of those things are invented by the Chinese during this time period, okay? We know that the iron industry dramatically increases. We know technological innovations. We see our first books printed. We see gunpowder being used. Okay, all of these things. And China, at this point, is far ahead of its European contemporaries. Remember that during this period, Europe is in the middle of the Dark Ages. Okay, Europe is nowhere near this level of innovation. Okay, Europe is very much in the Dark Ages while all of this is happening. Okay, and then what you see here, I'm not going to show this to you now, but there is a short video in this presentation you can watch later about movable type. Okay, who is drawing on my screen? Alejandro, is that you? All right, so eventually, and again, eventually because of trade, okay, mostly because of trade, eventually gunpowder and the compass reach Europe, and they happen to reach Europe at just the right moment. Okay, they don't get to Europe until that moment where European exploration is about to begin happening. Okay, and so, well, here, I'm going to go back for a minute before we get to gunpowder. Okay, because I think this is important. The compass gets to Europe at the very beginning of the age of exploration, as does gunpowder. And so right at that very important moment, gunpowder and the compass reach Europe, okay, just as they are beginning to explore, okay? And so Europe is able to use both of those technologies. They're able to use both of those things to their advantage during the age of exploration. And that's when the gunpowder empires come about, okay? That's when they're suddenly able to use the compass to look and to find and to go to the places that they want to get to. All right, so if we talk about gunpowder briefly, okay, things that you need to remember and things that you need to know about gunpowder is that they were discovered completely by accident. Okay, these Taoist scientists were looking for something called the elixir of life, and instead they ended up discovering something explosive, literally explosive. Okay, at first they wanted to use gunpowder. It was not used for the military. Okay, the gunpowder at first was used for political displays. Okay, they used it for fireworks to show their power, to show their wealth. And then at some point, a general realizes that if we can blow things up in the sky, we can blow up enemies as well. And so that is when it first gets used for its military purposes. Okay. Now, what you need to understand here about this graphic, okay, is that the reason that things take off the way that they do during the Renaissance, the reason that things take off during the European Renaissance that they do is because the Chinese and the Muslims had put all these things in place first, okay? And so you have to realize that without China and without the Muslims before them, Europe never would have been able to do the things that it did during the Renaissance, okay? Now, unfortunately, women in the Song dynasty, because Confucianism gets to be so prominent, women do not have a lot of rights, okay? We know that this is a very patriarchal society, okay? Women are still considered, or women still have to obey their husbands, okay? And women, you know, really do not have a lot of power, okay? And are not able to do very much, okay? They are trained from a very young age to be good wives and mothers, and that's it. Okay? And one of the ways, of course, that women in the Song dynasty show their inferiority to men is through the practice of foot binding. Okay? And so foot binding, of course, and I know we talked about this at the beginning of the year, is when a young woman's feet get wrapped very tightly. Okay, the bones in the foot get broken, and then when they are reset and regrow, they are pushed down in such a way that they regrow in a much smaller, very demure kind of a way, so that women really are no longer able to walk so much as shuffle. Okay, because of the foot binding. And this actually was thought to be an extremely erotic kind of a thing. And it was thought to be associated with beauty and with feminism, okay? So this was, you know, really thought to be kind of a good thing, if you will, if you are a Chinese girl or a Chinese woman, okay? But it very much showed your submission to men. Okay, and if women had any kind of inclination to leave or to go off on their own, they would not be able to do so if their feet were bound, obviously, because they could only move very slowly. So it really made them dependent on their husbands, to the point where women were never expected to leave the home. So kind of like what we're all doing right now, okay, that was a woman's life every single day within China at the time. Okay, because it very much kept them restricted. Okay, so there's some more lovely images for you of foot binding. Jan is blinded by this; he just can't take it. Again, there is another video here. When I post the PowerPoint later, you can watch the video if you want to. but it gives you some more information about foot binding. All right, and so here's the deal. Okay, women did have certain jobs. Okay, but they were, again, in the Song Dynasty, they were all positions that made them inferior to men. Okay, and so they could work in factories, they could work in restaurants, they worked as maids, they worked as dressmakers and cooks, and that sort of thing. Okay, they were certainly not holding very high positions. Oh, Darlene just raised her hand. Darlene, let me see if I can figure out how to, because I think Darlene has a question. So let's see, how do I do that? I'm gonna stop sharing. I'm gonna find Darlene and I'm gonna unmute her so that she can ask her question. Darlene, okay. Darlene, go ahead. Turn your mic on. Nope. Turn your mic on, Darlene. Oh, she's making fun of me.
Also has her hand raised, Mr.
Oh my god.
Y'all muted us.
Yeah.
Go, Gia, go.
You hear me? Job, bro. Yeah, give me some of them Oreos. Not even share.
What?
Why would I share my
Sorry.
Oreos? Hi, Lexi.
I am hungry and I don't get fed because my grandmother is watching church.
All right, we're gonna go back.
True.
Oh my God.
Alejandro, date me.
Wait, Skylar,
No,
where are you
why would you
here?
want that?
Okay. Darlene, if you have a question, you can type it and I'll try to answer it there. It's not working right. No, I know. Yeah, I don't know what you're, so Darlene, type the question and I'll try to answer it later. Okay, no worries, Darlene. For some reason, Kayla, you have a question. What's your question? I'm gonna unmute you. Go ahead, you're on.
You can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I can't even lie. I didn't have a question. I was just seeing if it worked.
Oh, it worked.
I'm sorry. My bad. That's on me.
No worries. Okay. So getting back to where we were, let's see, where was I? Here, share my screen again so that we can get back to where we were. Okay. So again, women were able to hold certain positions, and they were eventually able to inherit property if their husbands died. Okay, and they could eventually pay and be responsible for their own dowries eventually. And that is progress, I guess, to some extent, but just realize that they're still having to pay dowries. So how much progress could it actually be? Okay, and so there were some new opportunities, okay, but there was also a tightening of some of the laws as well. Now I see Matthew has an arrow that he keeps pointing to certain things. I don't know what that means. Matthew, what does that arrow mean? I just unmuted you.
No, please. That was an accident.
Okay, I'm gonna mute you again. Okay. All right, so here's a question for you, okay? The constant threat from the nomads, okay, is a continuity for this time period. This is something that China has had to face throughout its history, and it's something that would eventually lead for a while to its downfall because of the Mongols, okay? And so having to deal with these attacks from these nomadic tribes is a constant threat for them, okay? And so the first question then we want to think about is, why were the Chinese plagued by these nomadic attacks for well over 2,000 years? And then, whoops, actually that is the only question, okay? Why were the Chinese always plagued by these attacks for over 2,000 years? And so if you want to answer the question, do the hand raise thing. and then I think I can unmute you. And it should show me if you raise your hand. No, there's a button. You don't literally raise your hand. Like there's a button you have to press, and it'll tell me that you want to answer a question. No? Wait, somebody's typing in the chat. What are they saying? Yeah, how do you raise your hand? That's a great question. I don't know, but we should ask Kayla or we should ask Darlene. Darlene said to press the 3 little dots. Oh, Kirsten figured it out. All right, now how do I go to Kirsten? So it says Kirsten raised her hand. So let me see if I can find Kirsten and then I can unmute her. I'm learning this right along with you. So I wish there's not a way to search for people. I have to go through one by one, unfortunately. Kirsten, where are you? There you are. All right, Kirsten, unmute. There you go.
No, I was just gonna say this is how you like raise your hand. You have to click on the 3 little dots and scroll all the way down to the bottom.
Did everybody see that? Click on the 3 little dots, and then you scroll all the way to the bottom. That's how you raise your hand, apparently. Good job, Kirsten. Darlene's raising her hand again. Let's see if I can find her. All right, Darlene. Darlene, part 2. I'm gonna unmute you.
We unmuted you.
Did it work?
Go ahead, Darlene.
That's it. Oh, it's for me. It popped up. Like you just have to. Oh my god! You just have to touch the 3 dot things.
Yeah, all it is the 3 little dots.
And then you can lower it. You just have to press it again.
Aha. Okay. Shelly, did you want to answer the question, or are you just practicing?
How do I mute myself?
What?
How do I mute myself?
I'll mute you.
Oh wait.
You're muted now. All right. So now we know how to raise our hands. Oops. Okay. Oh, Jan's raising his hand. Hold on, Jan. Now I have to find you. Let's see. Jan, where are you? There you are. All right, Jan, I'm unmuting you. Go ahead.
I didn't want to do it. I was just checking if it worked.
Oh my God. Nobody wants to answer the question. All right, well then we're moving on. Okay. So, a couple things you have to think about here with regards to the nomads, okay? Particularly the ones up north, okay? These nomadic tribes from up north, their intrusion is going to be constant. It doesn't go away. Okay, part of that has to do with the fact that China is so big. They have a large land border. Okay, they're not, China is not a country and was not an empire that is surrounded by water on three sides, which is easy to kind of defend. China has the problem of being mostly land borders, okay? And so that's very easy to kind of invade, okay? And these nomadic tribes up north, they have a lot less arable land. It's a lot harder to farm. And so they certainly want and need products that are coming from mainland China. So one of the things that's fueling their invasions is their desire to obtain some of the goods, okay, particularly grains like rice, okay, but also many of those other products that come from China. And so the Great Wall, naturally, then was built to try to keep them out, okay? But here's the other thing. To a certain extent, the Chinese needed these nomads because they needed horses, they needed skins, they needed furs, okay? They needed all these things that the nomads were able to provide them. And it was the nomads who would eventually become the Mongols. It was the nomads who controlled a great deal of the trade, okay? Speaking of the Great Wall, oh, Blake has a question. Let me find Blake. Hold on, Blake. I have to find you first. Nope, that's Alejandro. Where's Blake? I'm looking, Blake. Give me a minute. Blake. The only way to do this is to go through everybody's name one at a time, so I'm apologizing. And I don't see you, Blake. I wish these names would be alphabetical, because that would make this. There you are, Blake. Go ahead.
I just want to ask, do you want a gummy worm?
No.
And I just clicked it on accident, so I thought you took all that time.
Her head.
So I thought I'd ask.
Yeah, Lexi looks extremely annoyed with you.
It was an accident, so I thought I'd ask. It was the
You're
last one.
right on my screen. So this is like the Brady Bunch. Like everybody is in a little box on my screen. It's like the Brady Bunch.
Oh, okay.
All right. Moving on to the Great Wall of China. So here's the thing about the Great Wall. It was as much a symbol of Chinese status, of course, as it was a way to keep people out. Because it is literally a brick wall, as you can see from this picture. Okay, and armies back then, they had ladders. Okay, they had ways to get over and get around these walls. So you have to think about it just as much a symbol of status as it was a way to literally keep people out. Okay, it is to show China's power just as much as it was to actually keep people out. Okay. All right. So speaking briefly now about Buddhism as we start to move towards the end of this. Okay. Buddhism comes, we know, from India. Okay. And Buddhism leads to the Chinese beginning to see themselves as a real empire because of the tribute system. Okay. As opposed to just this nomadic tribe. And so the Chinese, begin to become, during this time period, they become very self-sufficient because of the products and because of the things, right, that they produce. They are producing goods, and this is important. They are producing goods that are not just for their own use anymore. They are producing goods that they can sell to other people. Trade becomes a major aspect of this, okay? And so as they're consolidating and as they're acquiring territory and they're setting up these tribute systems, they are expanding trade as well. And so this is going to become a major continuity that you're going to see during this time period, which is that the Chinese get very involved in manufacturing, particularly in cheap manufacturing, okay? And that's continued right up until today, right? You've all heard about, and we've all seen goods that say made in China. Okay, the Chinese have become masters of cheap manufacturing. And so that is why so many goods for sale, even today, are still produced within China. Many of those goods were produced by groups of people that the Chinese conquered. And then through their tribute system, which is the idea that they had to accept Chinese rule and had to accept that the Chinese were superior to them. Through those things, they ended up in these lower level manufacturing jobs. Okay. All right. So the way that the tribute system worked, okay, it very much regulated China's relationship with a whole bunch of other neighboring civilizations, particularly Korea, Vietnam, and then the Japanese, okay? China protected them in exchange for certain other things, okay? Usually trade goods, okay? Like wine, silk, things of that nature, okay? But those were all bribes that were paid to these other countries in exchange for China protecting them, okay? And so the first one, okay, that we're going to look at very quickly is China's relationship with Korea. Okay, now China ultimately ended up conquering Korea, particularly up in the north. Okay, initially they were these bitter rivals. Then they, over time, sort of developed this, I don't want to say a good relationship, but it was a working relationship, I guess. They maintain political independence. Okay, so Korea remains separate, but they did have to pay into the tribute system, which means that the Koreans had to recognize China as being superior to them, and they had to give them or pay them certain products and certain goods. Okay, the Koreans actually wanted to copy a lot of what China had given to them. And so the Koreans ended up studying Confucianism. Unfortunately for women, though, this would have a negative effect because the women had more rights under Korean rule than they did Chinese rule. So it was actually worse for them. Okay. All right. Let's see. We know that Buddhism makes its way in there, but the big takeaway from this particular slide, again, is that some of their rights were taken away due to Confucianism. Okay. Now, Vietnam also borrows heavily from the Chinese. Vietnam adopts a lot of these Chinese ideas, including Confucianism, including Buddhism. Okay, but Vietnam has the benefit of being independent. Okay, they were also, unlike the Koreans, okay, they remained ruled by the Chinese for about 1,000 years. Okay, and they even considered the Chinese to be barbarians. So the Vietnamese were kind of thumbed their nose at the Chinese, despite the fact that they borrowed so many ideas from them. Okay, the Chinese expected Vietnam to sort of embrace them, both politically and then also culturally. Okay. And again, you can see, I'm not going to read all these off to you, but you can see some of the different ways that the Vietnamese ended up succumbing to the Chinese. The big thing is that Vietnam used the same mandate system that the Chinese did, which is the idea that their right to rule came directly from the gods, from the heavens. Okay. And then the last one we have to talk about then are the Japanese. Okay. And so the Japanese, well, just briefly before I do that, I just want to point out to you that you can see in terms of both a continuity and a change, you can see how both Japanese and Korean derive from Chinese writing. Okay, so that's an example of a bit of culture that the Chinese brought to these other two places. And then you can see how their writing system sort of evolved and sort of changed from that. Okay, so the last one we need to talk about then, the last thing are the Japanese. Okay, here's the big difference between Japan and those other countries. The Japanese have the benefit of being 100 miles away from China, right? There is a body of water separating them. Japan is an island, which meant that the Chinese were never successful in ever completely invading or conquering Japan. Okay, that body of water kept them separated. And so the Japanese only took the parts of culture that they wanted to take. Okay, they didn't, they weren't forced into anything because they were never actually conquered by the Chinese. So they were able to sort of pick and choose. Okay, they were able to kind of borrow what they wanted to borrow. And so you have these Japanese monks who visit China, okay, and these monks and these scholars, they come back and they only take back the ideas that they liked. They liked the calendar, they liked the way the court was set up, okay, they liked all of those things. They liked Buddhism, they liked Confucianism. So they sort of only brought back the things that they wanted to, because China never represented any kind of a threat to them, okay? Unfortunately, though, the Japanese were never as successful in setting up a Chinese system as they had hoped to be, okay? Mostly because of their size and because of other resources, right? That, you know, Japan is a much, much smaller island, and their moment is not going to come until much later on. The other big thing about the Japanese is that they're very decentralized, okay? And they have this warrior class, what we call the samurai, okay? And then finally, Buddhism never really takes hold there. It's replaced by another Japanese religion called Shintoism, okay? Which is, let me see, I have a picture of that. Okay, so here we go. So Shintoism is Japan's native religion, okay? And it's very similar to Buddhism, but it's very much based in nature, based in natural beliefs, okay? And so that's sort of what you see in Japan, even to this day, okay? It was never at any point replaced by Confucianism, okay? All right, so I'm gonna go back to the main screen here, and I'm going to unmute everybody now. And so for the last couple minutes, if anybody has any questions, so,
Kayla, did you see that?
I made breakfast. You guys are so messed up.
Four
Oh, shut
times.
up.
You know what? That was your father. It wasn't my It's not my problem that I called it out.
all right, so before I let everybody go, yes, I just muted everybody again. Why are we viewing Renzo's screen? There we go. Okay, so before I let everybody go, does anybody have any, Alejandro, does anybody have any questions or anything before we end the lesson?
Wait, did anyone do Renegade?
What happened?
I made really nice breakfast.
Mike?
All right, so I know some of you have another lesson to go to at 12, so we're gonna go ahead now. We're gonna end the call. I will be available and I'll be logged into Teams if you have any questions or anything starting at 1:30, and I'll be there until 4. So you can ask me any other questions you have then. But otherwise, at this point, we're gonna go ahead and end the meeting right now. This will be posted on the page so that you can see it later. All right, have a great day, guys. The Zoom video will be posted on the YouTube page. I saw that. Okay, so I will post it on that channel for you there. All right, have a great day, guys.